Welcome to r/Reddit Revenge. This is a story of someone getting back at someone with revenge after being wronged. And today we have 3 great stories, so subscribe, hit the like button, and let's begin. The first story: security guard detained me and called the police, was soon demoted for disturbing me. The second story: owner of the land was left without a crop. The third story: guy thought he was the best, but couldn't get a job at the company I worked for. The first story is the hospital security guard. This story took place in my early 20s in the section of a town in which most of the houses and apartments are rented to college students. It's a fun place to live when you're at that age, but I couldn't imagine having to live there now. Anyway, I digress. I don't drive, so I was a frequent walker, and I was frequently on one illicit substance or another, but this particular day, for one reason or another, I was completely sober. Although I was sober, I was in a particularly good mood. I had a little bit of a skip in my step. I was off in my own head, daydreaming about something pleasant. At this point, it's important for me to tell you that I have a nervous tic that is similar to Stevie Wonder's head movement. The tic gets worse under certain circumstances, and almost goes away under others. When I'm daydreaming, it goes crazy. Also drunk, high, sleepy, or lost in thought. When I'm super focused, the tic goes away almost completely. It's also important to note that I'm unaware of my head's movement. My eyes move opposite. So I'm walking near the hospital that sits in the center of this section of town. I'm daydreaming and my nervous tic is likely going crazy. I spot a hospital security car. Looks just like a cop car. Naturally, I snap to attention. My tic likely disappears. The guard goes by, but he clearly goes slow when he sees me. I'm nervous, but not for any reason, as I was sober, had no arrest warrants, and wasn't carrying any contraband. A minute or so after the guard's car is out of sight, I calm back down and almost immediately start daydreaming again. Likely tic comes right back. A few minutes later again, I notice the security guard's car, and again likely my tic goes away. The guard pulls over to the side and stops me. At this point, I'm a little more nervous. I don't like dealing with authority, and I'm sure this makes the security guard think I'm up to no good. It turns out he's a cop. Off duty perhaps, but a cop still. I didn't have my wallet on me, so when he asked to see my ID, I didn't have it. He was convinced I was on prohibited substances. Like I say, I've had cops think my nervous tic meant I was on prohibited substances many times, but I've never been on anything when a cop thought I was. He ordered me to sit on the curb while he called the city police for backup. I was an obedient little citizen. I sat quietly. The guard asked me for my social security number, name, and birth date. I gave them to him. He then would read them back to me wrong. I'd correct him. We went through this routine for 10 minutes. Finally, the actual on-duty police officer showed up. This is not a common thing for me. The cop comes up and talks to the guard, then to me. He asks me my information. I tell him. He asks me what I'm doing. I tell him I was just walking by on my way to a coffee house and I was detained by that guy for no reason. The cop tells me to hold tight and he'll be right back with me. He goes to his car, is there a minute or two, then comes back and tells me that I can be on my way. As I'm leaving, I hear the two of them talking. The cop basically tells the guy that I hadn't done anything, and they had no reason to hold me. I get down to the coffee house and I'm peeved the F off by what had happened, so obviously it's what I talk about. My buddies convinced me that I need to do something about this. Now, I'm not the litigious type, but I thought I could at least announce my displeasure. I wrote a letter to the hospital administrators. I explained that I was walking on a public sidewalk next to their hospital and was illegally detained by one of their officers based solely upon a documented medical condition. I told them that while I had that sort of thing happen to me previously, I thought that a hospital would be a place where I could count on not being discriminated on based on a medical condition. About a week later, I walked by that same hospital, and I saw said security guard. Did he have a nice security car anymore? No, he did not. Now he was guarding a parking lot, on the night shift. I will always remember purposefully walking under a bright streetlight, gaining his attention, smiling real big and walking away. On a related note, for the next year or so, I would receive a phone call from a different vice president of the hospital, apologizing and obviously trying to make sure I wasn't interested in suing. I got a call almost once every 3 weeks for the next year. Now, I know a lot of you are saying I should have sued, but honestly, I knew the hospital dealt with that issue, and that was all I was concerned about. Tell me what kind of security officer can demand so much identifying information, and why was he doing it on a public sidewalk? It's definitely a violation of his authority, which security has. The security guard should have been fired for such misconduct. But on the other hand, anyone can ask for anything. I can ask you for that information, but you don't have to give it. In this story, the OP gave that information. I can ask you to sit here while I call the police, but since I'm not a police officer, again, you don't have to comply. But if I stopped and detained you or got in your way by handcuffing you and not letting you leave the area, then yes, it is against the law. I'm surprised this security guard is still working. I used to work as a security guard at a hospital, and if someone was aggressive, I had no right to detain them. I could talk to them. Even if someone looked intoxicated, I didn't detain them. I just called the emergency line and gave a description and the direction they were going. The second story is, cancel a land lease and hope to make a windfall? Let me preface this by noting that this revenge was not my doing. At least not exactly. It happened back in the 90s when I was in high school and centered around the type of school I attended. So in case you aren't aware, it's very common in agricultural communities to have what are known as farmers' schools. That's not a technical term, but more just something easy to define them. The schools are generally organized by the local farmers, and while you still study the various courses needed to get into college, you also study farming technology courses and get credit hours for work study, i.e. working on one or more farms. The area I lived in was surrounded by a number of large farms, which grew cotton primarily. So during the year, we'd spend time out in the field both tilling, planting, and harvesting. One of the farms near the school was this 1,000-acre spread that, like the others, grew mostly cotton, though sometimes they rotated to soybeans or silage. Basically corn, but you don't harvest it. This farm had a long partnership with the school, so the students provided near free labor for the farmer. The farmer leased this property from some out-of-state owner and paid them a portion of the revenue from the harvest. Imagine my surprise then when I and many of my classmates arrived at the farm to do our work study, and the farmer instructed some to crew the sprayers and start spraying herbicide on the fields, while others, myself included, were to take tractors and discs and plow everything under. The farmer wanted every square inch of the fields returned to just dirt. We were shocked to say the least, but after some discussion we set to work. It took us the better part of a weekend to do so, and when we were done the field was in a beautiful, if barren state. The farmer thanked each of us personally and paid us about $500 each. Quite the sum for a 90s high school senior. We returned to the school, told our headmaster that the contract was completed, and he informed us that the farmer would no longer be working with the school, and we'd be sent to one of the other larger farms for the rest of the year, and our work study. It was probably 2 or 3 months later before word started going around about why we'd been instructed to destroy the crop. Granted, these were just rumors, but based on how things turned out for the farmer, I suspect there's some truth to it. So apparently the landowner had decided that he was going to not renew the lease the farmer had on the land. This lease renewal just so happened to fall a few weeks before harvest season would start. Given that the average cotton farm earns about $1,500 per acre, a 1,000-acre farm would easily net the owner $1.5 million, about $500K of that being pure profit. I don't know what the farmer's lease was, but it stands to reason that it wasn't anywhere near that. So this landowner had figured out a neat little trick. Let the farmer get a good crop planted, and then refuse to renew the lease. The farmer would leave the plants in the field, and the landowner would just need to pay some contractors to come harvest it, and they'd earn a profit. Since at the time the farmer's lease wasn't up yet, he decided to prevent that from happening. His act of revenge against the owner was to prevent them from cashing in on their hard work. Sure, it destroyed his farm, and he had to sell off most everything he owned to buy some property for himself, but he'd proved a point. The owner did try to sue the farmer, though he, the owner, really didn't have a leg to stand on, or so I was told. I think the court ruled that since the farmer was still under the lease when he had the land tilled under, then it was his property to do with as he wished, and thus the landowner couldn't tell him what to do with his property. I learned a rather valuable lesson from that man, beyond what I learned about farming. That lesson was never, ever cross someone with nothing to lose. Edit. Cotton is one of the few crops which leave a negative nutrient value in the soil, meaning that after harvest, even if you till the dead plants under, or even if you till them prior to harvest, you won't have as much nutrients as you started with. That's why farmers will plant another crop, usually winter wheat, in place, and then till it under rather than harvesting it. This is something commonly called a green manure, but it works to put nutrients that the cotton pulled out of the soil back into it. While the ground wouldn't have been completely dead or sterile, any crop planted on that tract of land, without further treatment of the soil, wouldn't have produced the same acre per acre yield that a comparable crop would have, had he gone to harvest and planted the secondary crop, which means that the landowner would either have to plant the green manure and spend money that way, or pay by the ton to use artificial fertilizer. Great story. The farmer was much smarter than the landowner. Also, the high school seniors were well paid for their work. This is similar to a story that happened to me. My wife and I were renting a house. The house had no repairs, but since we needed an apartment right away, we agreed. The same went for the garden and the yard. Everything was empty and old. My wife and I weren't making much money, but we still tried to make a home for ourselves and renovate the garden. We put a lot of effort into planning a nice garden and maintaining the property. The landlord refused to put a penny into it, but decided to raise the rent. We couldn't pay the rent, so we had to move. Fortunately, we kept detailed receipts for how much we spent to decorate the garden. Soon we moved and took everything we had planted with us, leaving the yard empty. The landlord tried to throw a tantrum because the next tenants agreed to the price, expecting it to include the garden, but it was gone. The last story is finding out I got the job my arrogant family friend, who told me I was stupid, got rejected from. I have a close family friend who I grew up alongside. We had an intense rivalry when we were kids, and he loved to make fun of me. One of his favorite insults was to call me stupid and make me feel super incompetent. I remember a particular gathering when I was in year 7, when I jokingly confessed that I messed up a math test. He then spent the rest of the evening telling everyone at this gathering that he was a straight A student, and that I was a failure. Verbatim, he made digs about me being an idiot routinely for years, and at one point it genuinely affected my self-esteem. Anyway, our families grew apart. I got older and stopped seeing him for several years. Last week though, I went to his sister's wedding, and our families were talking. His brother mentioned that he applied for clerkships at the top-tier law firms in our city. We're both law students, by the way, and he was rejected by them all. Everyone else then tried to console him. He was visibly irritated by this, and commented things like, "Oh, it's really competitive. Hardly anyone gets in these days." I didn't say anything, but then his mother asked me if I was working, and I said yes, and then she asked where. At first I contemplated saying something like, "Oh, just a place in the city," but then I decided it was too good an opportunity to pass up, so instead I chose to look him straight in the face and name one of the firms he was rejected from. Everyone went silent for a minute, and I can't explain how satisfying it was to see the astonished look on his face. Just to clarify though, I don't think grades or a fancy job are a measure of intelligence, or a person's worth at all, but he definitely does, and it was just a really petty win for me because the guy was a total jack-A. OP, your moment was glorious, and in my humble opinion, you did the right thing for the moment. This arrogant guy needed a dose of reality. Life will show him later that he has you to thank. You wonder how it's possible that he ended up like that, having such a good mother. I've seen several cases where too much sweetness makes children complacent and unserious. Maybe that's the point? My godparents had a son. We went to the same year, different schools. He talked about how smart he was, about all the AP classes he took, and acted like I was dumb when I didn't know the answer to some question from a course he was taking. But I did. He really wanted to go to university, but he couldn't get in. He didn't know that I could get into that university after all. Half a year later, our parents met, and his mother asked which university I got into. She was shocked when she found out that I got into the university her son wanted to go to. I hope you love these stories. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to know when the new video comes out.